Hello, this is Aaron. I just wanted to throw together a quick demo map of the synth drop that I was talking about on Twitter because it was a pretty, as my tweets go, pretty popular tweet, and I figured if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a video is worth 1,000 pictures, and I could just show you this working. Here's the blueprint. I'll walk through it in a second, but I'll first just demo it before walking through it. So basically, every time I hit the one key, it does a little randomized synth drop. Boom. Boom. You could combine this with an explosion or a big cinematic moment and win an Oscar. A game Oscar. Yeah. All right, so you can stop the video now if you don't care about how I did it or if you're not interested. But so the image I tweeted out, I had thrown together quickly since I was going to make a video and walk through it. I just cleaned it up a little bit. It's essentially the same thing that I tweeted. The difference is I hooked up an event control so that you can have input. That's what this guy. So essentially, just real quick, if you don't know Blueprint, apologies if you already do. This is kind of common. This chunk right here is when the Blueprint begins to play. This event gets called, and I grab the player controller, which is me. I'm the player controller, and I enable input. This means keyboard input, so that when I go to push 1, when I'm playing, I can actually get that event to be registered to this blueprint. It's really basic kind of a thing. And then here, I actually set the preset to use on the synthesizer. It's a synth component. And then here I'm starting the synthesizer so that it's ready to have commands. This is important because you don't want the synthesizer just running all the time, even if it has no chance of actually playing any audio or doing anything, playing notes, etc. One thing to watch out for is that the synth doesn't automatically get activated. There's a difference between activation and starting in synthesis. I've debated if I just use activation as an implicit for start. I may do that in the future, so you don't even have to start because this trips up people.
Hey,
I'm doing a video, Ethan. Just give me a second.
Sorry.
So Ethan just came in. Hey, do you want to say hi?
Hey, how you doing?
It's just a screenshot. They can't see you, but this is Ethan Geller, everybody.
Oh, but I thought this was live. So.
It is live. Well, it's not live, but I'm gonna.
It's recording.
It's
okay,
recording.
Yeah.
This is gonna be one take, but everybody. Anyways, so you start the synth. Then here I get the key binding for 1, and I just play a note, and I randomly pick the note to play. These are MIDI notes, so this is randomly choosing between 40 and 60. Intentionally, MIDI notes are floats, so you can get float MIDI values. I just chose to hit the MIDI key velocity to be 120. Duration -1 means to keep playing the note until you manually say note off. So you could specify a 1-second duration or randomize the duration. But I want the note duration to be actually triggered by this timeline, which I'll explain in a second. So then once I play the note, then according to the sequencer, I go and I randomize the play rate of my timeline, and then I trigger this timeline, which I'll explain in a second. But this is the thing that actually does the pew sound, and it outputs a pitch track value. This is sort of normalized between -1 and 1. Actually, I kind of wanted it to be 0 to 1 or -1. This maps that range between -1 and 10. I typically like my timelines to be normalized so that I can do output mapping independently, because that kind of is a tweakable that's easy to do without having to go and reauthor your curve. And then on the modular synth, I set the oscillator frequency modulation. This is basically how you drive frequency modulation from Blueprint. All of the parameters that you would expect for subtractive synth are modulatable from Blueprint, but also can be hooked up to LFOs and things like that within the synth, and they all should play nicely together. So you could have, for example, an oscillator that's slowly oscillating like if you wanted. This would still not clash with this pitch curve. And then when back to the timeline, when it's finished, I turn off the synthesizer. So real quick, the timeline here, if you double click it, if you haven't messed with this in Blueprint UE4, basically this is exactly what you'd see in a DAW for parameter automation. I'm not going to mess with this one because it's nicely tuned, but just to show you, you just say add timeline, my new timeline, name it whatever you want, and then double clicking it, you see this blank interface. I can add params as much as I want, so let's call it param1. I can add another one, param2. You can add as many as you want, and these are up to you to add a you know, however you want your curve to be. They can be anything within any range. Like I said, I like to keep mine relatively normalized, but you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can set the length of the timeline. So this is like timeline goes through and sweeps through this automatically through time, like that, 20 seconds. So let's just do like a whatever, it doesn't matter. Nice thing about here is that when you select the points, you can smooth them out automatically, which is a really nice feature. Or you could manually do it. You can grab one of these and mess with it. It's a little Bezier curve. You can also drive these things by an external curve. UE4 curves are separate assets. So if you wanted to use timelines in multiple blueprints but not re-author the curve exactly between the different blueprints, you could author a curve just to show you up here. New, I think it's in miscellaneous curve right here, this asset right here. And you can have whatever float, a color curve or a vector curve. So your curve would look like, curve editor would, not surprisingly, look like the curves that you just saw. So you could author this one here and then just drop it in right there. So I think if I selected this and then went back to here, it should just pop. And then you can actually visually see it there, which is really cool. You can also loop the whole timeline. We also have a vector track you can do here. Vector tracks would be really useful for audio, you know, whatever. Because the nice thing about this is when I add events, they colorize separately. So you could see multiple parameters on top of each other. So if you wanted to do some kind of parameter automation off of like maybe a blend based on distance, you could do something like this so that one sound gets blended for near, medium, and far based on distance. So for example, like this. You know, some kind of crossfade like this. However you wanted to do it. And then you can do like this. Go auto. Nice and smooth. So, you know, let's say the x-axis, I can't talk, was distance. Then this would output. Sometimes Bezier curves aren't the greatest. You can see they kind of go below the value. But anyways, you know, this value would be 1, then it would go to 0, then you'd have this mid-range, and you go 5. But you're like, this is a timeline. It's not a distance line. Turns out one of my personal complaints about the timeline is that it's called a timeline at all. I feel like it should just be called automation curves or something. It defaults to have the x-axis driven by time. If you just push play, it assumes time. But you can actually externally drive the timeline, which is really cool. So set new time, etc. So in a way, you can kind of co-opt the timeline to be driven every tick by some other parameter. I'm considering at some point making a very totally agnostic timeline concept and just sort of borrow the UI curve, so it's very clear that it needs to be driven by an external event. In which case, you could potentially put this. There's details about blueprints that I'm not going to get into here, but one of the things that restrictions of timelines is that they can only be inside a event graph. That's what this thing is right here. But you know, in blueprints you can write functions which are not in the event graphs. You see graph here events, and then this is a function. You can't use timelines and functions. But if you had a eventless timeline, aka parameter automation curves, you could drive these in functions. But that's an idea for the future. Anyways, it's a really useful tool. You can see right here all of my param pins have showed up. You see this audio track. Oh, one more thing that these can do for audio people out there is you can also have arbitrary events here. So just to be complete, these aren't curves. They just trigger on events. And if you add a bunch, let's see, you can make another event track. whatever you want, and then you go back to the event graph here, you'll see the events are execution pins, and so these would trigger whenever the event got triggered, and that's it. And so you have a... Oh, one more thing I just kind of skipped over. On the modular synth itself, if you want to add it, you just go mod synth like that, and it just adds it as a component. It has all the functionality of all the rest of audio, so you can spatialize it, mix it, add effects, you know, model air absorption, attenuation versus distance, all that kind of stuff. And I recommend doing presets using a variable down here called, you know, you name it whatever you want. This, if you're new to blueprints, this is how you add variables to your blueprint. So my variable, you change the variable type by clicking this thing, and there's a bajillion different types. Every single thing in UE4 can be turned into a variable, including your module. If you just type mod, it'll autocomplete, and then that's how you get the modules in the preset. And then over here, you'll see default value. It says, please compile the blueprint. We listen to them, and boom, all of the parameters show up. This is all of the parameters that you would expect in a subtractive synthesizer. It's technically semi-modular, not fully modular, and you can, what makes it semi-modular is that you can kind of patch arbitrary parameters to things arbitrarily. It's a whole basically patching mechanic. So it's a patch. Parameters can be modulated arbitrarily. It's very fun. But anyways, my preset is this guy, mod synth preset here, and you can see I've set it to be sine wave. It's very, very basic. And then my attack, decay, sustain, release, 20 milliseconds on attack, decay of 100. I set the release to 200, and made sure that there's no other effects. I could, just to show you that this is one actually playing, a fun thing is to double up the octaves. So we can do, like, let's make the second oscillator 2 octaves up. Then we go back over here. Which is really exciting. That's pretty much it. The video's already too long. Hopefully you enjoyed it.